When I was younger, I thought love had an age limit, that it was something you find once, maybe twice if the universe feels generous, and after that, you just live on memories. For 21 years, I was Mrs. Helena Duarte, wife of a good man, mother of a brilliant daughter, a woman who lived by the rules, until life took those rules away one by one. After my husband's passing, silence became my closest companion. It followed me into every room, sat with me at breakfast, echoed in every hallway of the house he built for us. People used to say, time heals, but no one ever told me that healing feels a lot like forgetting who you used to be. Then, one spring morning, something unexpected happened. A friend insisted I join a culinary workshop in Tuscany. Go, she said. You need air, new people, new flavors. I went with no expectations, just a suitcase and a heart too tired to hope. And that's where I met him, Enzo. He wasn't loud or charming in the usual way. He didn't flirt, didn't talk too much, didn't even ask for my number at first. He simply noticed things. That I liked my coffee with cinnamon. That I held my breath every time the sun hit the vineyard in a certain way. That I still wore my wedding ring, even though I didn't look at it. He taught me how to make risotto the Italian way, slowly, patiently, stirring with love. And in that rhythm, something inside me softened. The kind of softness that comes not from weakness, but from remembering you're still alive. When the workshop ended, he asked me if I believed in second chances. I said I used to. He smiled and replied, then maybe it's time you believe again. And that was the moment I realized grief had been keeping me loyal to a ghost. But Enzo, he was real. We started talking every day after I returned to Brazil. Short calls turned into long nights of laughter and recipes shared across oceans. He'd cook in his kitchen, I'd try to follow in mine. To cameras, to hearts, and one growing truth. I wasn't done living. After months of distance, he came to visit. He said, Helena, I want to meet the people who made you who you are. And that's when I made the decision. A dinner, small, intimate, just us, and my daughter, Amanda. Amanda, 37, successful, strong, and everything I once wanted to be. But with a sharpness life never gave me. She lost her father young, and in many ways, she blamed me for moving on too soon, even though I hadn't moved on at all. The idea of me dating again felt to her like betrayal. She once told a friend, Mom's too old for that kind of happiness. I pretended I didn't hear, but I did, and it stayed. So tonight wasn't just a dinner. It was a test, a quiet war disguised as family gathering. As I prepared the table, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The pearls around my neck, a gift from my late husband. The dress, black, elegant, nothing too revealing. And the fear behind my eyes, that hadn't changed in years. When Enzo arrived, the house seemed warmer. He brought flowers, tulips, white like peace. He kissed my hand and said softly, breathe, amor. Tonight is just dinner. But he didn't know Amanda. And Amanda never just had dinner. When the doorbell rang again, I froze. The sound echoed through the dining room like a warning bell. I opened the door, and there she was. Perfect posture, flawless makeup. The same cold politeness that could cut glass. Hi, Mom, she said. So this is the famous chef. Her tone wasn't curious. It was sharp, laced with quiet disapproval. Enzo smiled gently, offering his hand. She took it without looking at him. Inside the house, the scent of roasted rosemary and butter filled the air. But the real flavor of the night was tension. We sat down. The chandelier above us flickered slightly, as if it could feel the unease. I poured the wine, my hands trembling just enough to betray my nerves. Amanda sat across from Enzo, studying him like a character she'd already decided she didn't like. He asked about her work. She answered with polite brevity. He complimented her dress. She ignored him. At one point, she leaned closer to me and whispered, Mom, he's young enough to be my brother. Don't you find that embarrassing? I wanted to say so many things about love, about loneliness, about how age becomes irrelevant when you finally stop pretending to live for others. But instead, I smiled, because sometimes silence has more dignity than any argument. As the conversation stumbled from one awkward pause to another, I found myself thinking about how easily love can turn into offense, not because it's wrong, but because it dares to defy expectation. Amanda wasn't cruel. She was scared of losing her place in a story she thought was hers to control. And I, foolishly, had invited that fear to dinner. Still, I wanted to believe things could go well, that the smell of good food, the warmth of wine, and the presence of someone kind could melt the ice between us. But deep down, I knew something was coming, a moment that would change everything. Enzo reached for my hand under the table, discreet, comforting. I squeezed back, forcing a smile. For him, for her, for myself. And in that small gesture, I realized how fragile peace can be when pride sits at the same table. Some stories don't begin with love or hate. They begin with silence, the kind that hides both. And as the clock struck 8, I looked at Amanda's face and saw it there, a calm too perfect to trust. Tonight, the plates would hold more than food. They would hold truth, judgment, and something I hadn't seen in years, the reflection of who we really were as a family. If you've ever sat at a table where love and resentment shared the same wine glass, you'll understand what I felt that night. And if you've ever watched someone try to destroy your peace, just because they couldn't find their own, this story might hit closer than you think. So before we start this dinner, before you hear what happened next, make sure you're part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment if you've ever faced judgment for choosing happiness, and tell me, would you have invited them to dinner? Because that night, as we sat down to eat, I thought I was serving dinner, but life had prepared something else. Dinner began like a fragile performance, everyone pretending not to know their lines. The silver cutlery gleamed under the chandelier, the wine shimmered a deep ruby red, and for a moment, it almost looked like harmony. Almost. Enzo moved around the table with the ease of someone who had spent his life serving others. He smiled softly, adjusting the napkin at his lap, thanking Amanda for coming, though she hadn't smiled once since she'd arrived. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, like she was dissecting every movement, every word, searching for proof of whatever story she had already written about him in her mind. I tried to fill the silence. I asked about her work, the marketing firm, the promotion she'd mentioned weeks ago. She shrugged, said she was too busy for small talk. Then she turned to Enzo, her voice coated in polite venom. So, chef, tell me, what exactly do you see in my mother? The words cut through the air like a shard of glass. The music stopped playing, even though no one had touched the remote. Enzo smiled. Not defensive, not wounded, just calm. He took a sip of wine and said, the same thing everyone should see in her: strength, grace, and the kind of beauty that doesn't ask for permission to exist. Amanda laughed, but it wasn't laughter. It was a scoff disguised as charm, right? Grace and beauty. Convenient words for someone who met her in Italy, on vacation. You must have loved the view. I felt my throat tighten. Every syllable from my daughter carried years of bitterness, disguised as concern. And yet, beneath her mockery, I could feel the ache of someone who hadn't healed from her own losses. She had lost her father, but she had also lost the version of me who lived for her. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away, pretending to adjust her bracelet. Enzo continued eating quietly. He didn't need to prove anything, and somehow, that infuriated her even more. She lifted her glass. To new beginnings, she said, but her tone turned the words into an accusation. Enzo raised his glass too. To second chances, he replied. For a few seconds, they looked at each other, daughter and lover, The strangers locked in a silent war over the same woman. The candles flickered. The smell of roasted lamb filled the room. And beneath it all, something darker was simmering. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her voice light but cold. Do you ever wonder what people will say, Mom? About the age difference? I didn't answer immediately. I just smiled faintly and said, people will say many things, Amanda. They always do. She rolled her eyes. So it doesn't bother you that he's after your money? Enzo froze for a split second. Not enough for her to notice, but enough for me to feel the sting. I placed my fork down gently. Amanda, that's enough. But she wasn't done. You're being naive. He's young, attractive, and suddenly interested in a widow with property in Ipanema. Please, Mom. I may not be romantic, but I'm not blind. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from restraint. I could feel my pulse echoing in my ears. Enzo wiped his mouth with the napkin, looked directly at her, and said in a tone so composed it frightened me, maybe I am after something, but it's not her money, it's her time. Because time, Amanda, is the only thing you can't buy, and the only thing most people waste. Amanda didn't respond. For the first time that evening, she looked unsure. Not defeated, but shaken. I watched her lips press into a tight line as she stabbed her fork into her food. And then, with emotion so small yet so violent, she leaned forward and whispered something I barely heard. Pathetic. A single word. Enough to turn the warmth of the room into frost. The dinner went on in strained silence. Knives scraped against plates. The wine tasted bitter. And then came the moment I will never forget. As I stood to bring out the dessert, I caught it. A flash of movement from the corner of my eye. Amanda, leaning over Enzo's plate. Her expression blank, her actions too quick to be casual. I watched, frozen, as she spit. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. And so did he. He didn't react. Not a word, not a glance of disgust. He simply waited, calm, almost eerily so. I felt the blood drain from my face. My first instinct was to scream, to throw her out, to end this humiliation. But something in Enzo's eyes stopped me. He looked at me, just for a second, a quiet signal. Don't. He picked up the plate as if nothing had happened. And before I could stop him, he took a single bite. My heart broke open, but Enzo only smiled faintly, as if tasting the bitterness of something he'd expected all along. Amanda looked almost triumphant, as if she had proven something, though I couldn't tell what. Her hand trembled slightly when she reached for her wine. I wanted to say her name, to stop this madness, but my voice wouldn't come out. The air felt heavy, too thick to breathe. The room was still, except for the sound of Enzo placing his fork down. He looked around the table, his gaze gentle but unyielding. And for the first time that night, he spoke in a voice that filled the silence like a prayer. Helena, he said softly, may I make a toast? Amanda leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes glinting with defiance. Of course, she said. I'm curious to hear this one. And as he stood, lifting his glass, I realized something profound. He wasn't just about to respond to her insult. He was about to change the entire meaning of the evening, without raising his voice. But that moment, that toast, is another story. If you've ever watched someone destroy peace at the same table where they were loved, you'll understand what I lived that night. Sometimes the cruelest people don't need to shout, they only need to smile. Enzo rose from his chair with a quiet grace that demanded attention. Not the kind that shouts for it, but the kind that silences a room by existing. He held his glass delicately, as if it carried something sacred, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The chandelier above us reflected in the wine like liquid fire, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the ticking of the clock, the rhythm of our breathing, 3 lives suspended in a single heartbeat. Then his voice came, calm, deep, steady. The kind of voice that doesn't ask to be heard. It simply is. "I'd like to make a toast," he said. His tone was so even that it didn't sound like a declaration. It sounded like a decision. Amanda leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk forming on her lips. She thought he was going to defend himself, explain, justify, maybe even beg for approval. But she didn't understand the kind of man Enzo was. He didn't argue. He revealed. To honesty, he began. Because people like to talk about it as if it were easy, as if it were convenient. But honesty, it's a luxury most people can't afford. It costs too much. It demands that you look in the mirror and admit what you see, not what you pretend to be. He let the words breathe. I felt them crawl under my skin. Amanda smiled tightly, swirling her wine, trying to look amused, but her knuckles were turning white around the glass stem. Enzo's gaze never left her. It wasn't confrontational. It was surgical. To truth. He continued. Because truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in the smallest gestures, the ones you think no one notices. But someone always does. My heart was pounding so hard I thought the tablecloth might tremble. He wasn't talking about what happened. He was describing it, with poetry instead of accusation. And in that poetic calm, there was a kind of justice more painful than anger. Amanda tried to interrupt him. "That's beautiful," she said sarcastically. "Maybe you should write a book." Enzo smiled. "Maybe I will. I've learned so much about people this year." His tone was soft, but it carried weight, and a quiet kind of irony that didn't need to be named. He raised the glass a little higher. "Let's drink," he said, "to the courage it takes to be kind in a room full of knives." I held my breath. He turned to me, and his expression softened. "Helena, thank you for the dinner, for opening your home, for believing that some things can begin again, even when others can't stand to watch." Then he looked back at Amanda. His face was peaceful. His eyes were piercing. "And to you," he said gently, "I want to say this. Never ruin something beautiful just because it doesn't belong to you. Because when you spit on what others cherish, the bitterness stays, not in their mouth, but in yours." Silence. No one breathed. Amanda's face froze. Her hand trembled, her glass shaking slightly. A small clink echoed as the crystal touched the plate. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to laugh, but no sound came out. The room had shifted. The air was thicker, heavier, but strangely calm. I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw my daughter not as the confident, stubborn woman she showed the world, but as a little girl cornered by her own pride. She tried to hide behind her wine glass again, bringing it to her lips. But her hands were unsteady. She drank too fast. A single drop slid down her chin. Then she coughed once, then again. The kind of cough that breaks silence like thunder. Her face turned red. The veins on her neck tensed. And Enzo, still standing, didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He didn't flinch. He simply placed his glass on the table, tilted his head slightly, and said softly, so softly I almost missed it, "Careful. It's easy to choke when the truth finally goes down." Amanda froze. Her breathing steadied. But her eyes, those sharp, proud eyes, had lost something. For the first time that evening, they looked human, vulnerable. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the faint flicker of the candles, slowly melting down. I sat there, my chest tight, my throat dry, my heart somewhere between pain and relief. Enzo had done the impossible. He had restored dignity without cruelty. He had turned humiliation into reflection. Amanda wiped her mouth quietly, her pride shattered into silence. She didn't apologize. That would have been too much for her. But she didn't say another word. We finished the dinner as if it were a ceremony of ghosts. Every bite tasted like memory. Every sip of wine carried the heaviness of unspoken truths. When the plates were cleared, Amanda stood. She kissed my cheek mechanically, leaving a faint trace of perfume and discomfort. Then she looked at Enzo. "I suppose I misjudged you," she muttered. Not quite an apology, not quite defiance. He smiled politely. "We all misjudge what we don't understand." She blinked, unable to respond, and turned toward the door. The sound of her heels faded down the hall, sharp and rhythmic, like punctuation marks ending a chapter that would never be rewritten. For a long while after she left, I didn't move. The dining room was quiet again. Not peaceful, but honest. Enzo sat back down, poured the last drop of wine into my glass. "She's not cruel," he said softly. "She's just afraid." People who fear losing control will always destroy what reminds them they don't have it. I looked at him, this young man who had entered my life when I least expected it, who carried more emotional maturity than most people twice his age. "You didn't have to eat that plate," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Helena, we have to taste the bitterness to show others what it truly is." Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, from the strange peace that follows truth. It's heavy, but it's clean. It doesn't scream. It just settles. Outside, the night had turned quiet. The wind brushed against the curtains, carrying the scent of the ocean. I closed my eyes for a moment and realized something I had forgotten for years. Grace doesn't mean weakness. Forgiveness isn't surrender. And sometimes, dignity is the loudest form of revenge. If you've ever had to stand in silence while someone tried to humiliate you, if you've ever learned that composure can cut deeper than rage, you already know what that dinner really meant. It wasn't about food. It wasn't about age, or jealousy, or pride. It was about truth finally being served, without needing dessert. So, before this story fades into the quiet, subscribe to the channel. Leave your comment and tell me, have you ever seen someone fall silent when Grace exposed their cruelty? And don't forget to leave a like, because sometimes the most powerful comeback is to stay calm while the storm destroys itself. The moment the door closed, the sound echoed through the house like a confession. It wasn't just a door shutting, it was a chapter ending. And the silence that followed was not peace. It was the echo of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. The air in the dining room felt thick, heavy, almost visible. Candles still burned on the table, their flames trembling from the faint draft Amanda had left behind. Their light flickered over the plates, half-eaten food, smudged napkins, the faint red stain of spilled wine. Every trace of that dinner looked like the aftermath of a battle where no one had won. Enzo began collecting the plates without a word. He didn't look at me. He didn't sigh or complain. He just moved quietly, like a man cleaning the ruins after a storm. I watched him in silence, my chest tight, the tears threatening but refusing to fall. He stacked the plates one by one, his movements precise and methodical. There was something almost sacred in the way he handled everything, even the broken, even the stained. When he passed by me to take the glasses, our arms brushed. His touch was gentle, grounding, real. Finally, I found my voice. "You didn't have to do that," I whispered. He stopped, turned to face me. "Do what?" "Let her treat you like that. Pretend it didn't hurt." He smiled faintly, a smile filled with both kindness and fatigue. "I didn't pretend," he said. "I chose not to let her see that it did." His answer cut through me in a way Amanda's cruelty hadn't, because it carried truth. And truth, when spoken without defense or bitterness, has a way of humbling even the strongest pride. I sat down, my body finally surrendering to the weight of the evening. My hands trembled slightly, resting on the linen tablecloth that still smelled faintly of rosemary and butter. That smell, once comforting, now felt heavy with memory. Like a perfume worn to a funeral, Enzo carried the last dish to the kitchen. The sound of running water filled the silence, steady, gentle, healing. He washed each plate as if rinsing away the evening itself. When he turned off the faucet, The house seemed to exhale. He leaned against the counter, drying his hands slowly, eyes lowered, voice calm. "She's hurting," he said softly. "People who hurt others are usually just trying to distract themselves from their own wounds." I wanted to believe him, but all I could feel was a mixture of rage and guilt. Rage at my daughter for humiliating the man I loved. Guilt for wondering if, in some way, I had raised her to believe love had to be deserved, measured, or explained. "She's my daughter," I murmured, "and I didn't recognize her tonight." He nodded, his eyes still gentle. "Sometimes love hides behind cruelty. Sometimes it takes years for it to find another form." His words lingered in the air like incense, soft but penetrating. He walked back toward me, stopping a few steps away. "You know," he said, "you didn't lose tonight, Helena. You taught her something she's not ready to understand yet. One day, she will." I looked up at him, and something inside me broke. Not painfully, but in relief. The kind of breaking that frees you from pretending. I started to cry. Not loud tears, not the desperate kind. Just quiet, steady tears that carried everything I had kept locked away for too long. He didn't rush to comfort me. He just sat beside me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his presence. And in that silence, I found more safety than in 1,000 words. "I should have stood up for you," I said finally. He shook his head. "No, you did the hardest thing. You let truth defend itself. And it did, better than either of us could have." We stayed there for a long while. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the city had quieted. Even the ocean seemed slower, its waves rolling in lazy whispers against the shore. At some point, I rose to clear the table. Enzo tried to stop me, but I insisted. "I need to," I said. "It feels wrong to leave it like this." As I gathered the napkins, I noticed Amanda's glass, still half full, with a faint red smear of lipstick on the rim. It caught the light, and for a moment, I just stared at it. Something about that image, the elegance, the residue, the stillness, said everything about her. Beautiful, defiant, broken. I touched the rim with my fingertips and whispered to myself, "She's still my little girl." Then I carried the glass to the sink, letting the warm water wash away the last trace of her presence. When I turned around, Enzo was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that same quiet patience that had made me fall for him in the first place. He said, "You know what I love most about you?" I smiled weakly. "That I'm stubborn." He shook his head. "That you still believe people can change, even when they hurt you." I didn't answer, because he was right. No matter how many times I'd been disappointed, I still wanted to believe there was something good beneath the wreckage. After the kitchen was spotless again, we turned off the lights and climbed the stairs in silence. The house creaked softly beneath our steps. The same sounds that used to make me feel lonely now felt alive, as if the house itself had survived the evening and was quietly recovering with us. In our room, I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my black dress. The moonlight spilled through the window, tracing silver patterns across the floor. Enzo sat beside me, unbuttoned his cuffs, and reached for my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, human. "She'll come around," he said gently. "But you can't rush her. Pride takes time to die. I don't know if I want her forgiveness," I confessed. "I just want her to stop seeing me as a threat." He smiled faintly. "You stopped being what she expected. That's all it takes to scare people." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who was half my age, yet somehow twice as steady. He had faced cruelty with calm, humiliation with grace, and turned pain into poetry. And I realized, maybe love doesn't come to rescue us. Maybe it comes to remind us who we are when everything else has fallen apart. The clock on the nightstand ticked quietly. Outside, a storm was gathering, faint thunder in the distance, the smell of rain drifting through the open window. I could feel the air changing, soft electricity in the room. It matched the ache inside me. That blend of sadness, relief, and something like gratitude. When the first drop of rain hit the window pane, Enzo whispered, "You know what I admired most tonight?" I turned my head toward him. "What? That you didn't try to fix it," he said. "You let her see herself. That takes courage." For the first time that night, I smiled, a real smile. "Maybe I learned that from you." He chuckled softly, lying back on the bed. "And here I was thinking I came to teach you how to make risotto." I laughed through the tears. And for the first time in years, the sound didn't feel like guilt. It felt like release. As we lay there listening to the rain, I thought about the dinner, about Amanda's face when the truth reached her throat, about the calm that followed. The world didn't end. No one screamed. No plates broke. Only illusions did. Sometimes storms don't destroy, they cleanse. And that night, the storm outside was gentle, almost kind. If you've ever lived through a moment that stripped you down to truth, if you've ever faced someone you love and realized they might never understand you, then you know the silence that came after that dinner. It wasn't emptiness. It was honesty. Because sometimes peace doesn't arrive with forgiveness. It arrives with acceptance. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had stopped fighting it. The rain had stopped before dawn. I woke to the faint sound of waves returning to their rhythm, as if the ocean itself had decided that the night's storm was enough. The first light filtered through the curtains, pale and soft, brushing the room in gold. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I simply lay there, breathing in the quiet, listening to the subtle hum of the world rebuilding itself. Enzo was no longer beside me. The sheet still held his warmth, the faint trace of his cologne, wood, smoke, and something like calm. I could hear faint noises coming from downstairs, the clinking of cups, the scrape of a chair, the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. I closed my eyes again. There was something sacred about those sounds, domestic, ordinary, human. It had been years since mornings had felt like this. For so long, I had woken to silence, to ghosts, to the mechanical routine of someone waiting for nothing. But now, even the simplest noise felt like a promise. When I finally got up, I noticed the dress I'd worn last night draped neatly over the chair. The pearls were still on the dresser, the clasp undone, like a heart learning to loosen. I touched them gently, then walked barefoot down the hallway. Each step felt like crossing a small distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming. In the kitchen, Enzo stood by the counter, barefoot, hair still damp from the shower, flipping pancakes on the griddle with the precision of a sculptor. The sunlight poured over him like approval. He turned when he heard me, smiled, that quiet, effortless smile that never tried to fix anything, just made it easier to breathe. "Good morning," he said. "Hungry?" I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, still wrapped in the echo of last night. "I don't know if hunger is the right word," I replied, "but something feels empty." In a good way. He nodded as he poured honey into a small bowl. "That's what peace feels like at first. Like silence in a house that forgot how to rest." He placed a plate in front of me. Golden pancakes, dusted with sugar, with a few raspberries scattered like rubies. The smell of coffee filled the air, rich and warm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence between us with words. I took a bite, sweet, soft, simple, and somehow sacred. He watched me eat with quiet satisfaction. After a while, he said, "She'll call." I paused, my fork midway. "Will she?" "Yes." Not to apologize, but because silence will make her uncomfortable. People like her need noise to feel in control. I smiled faintly. "You really think you know her already?" He sipped his coffee. "No, but I know pain when I see it. She looks at you the way people look at mirrors they don't want to face." That truth landed softly, like a feather, gentle, but impossible to ignore. I looked out the window. The garden was soaked, the flowers bent but unbroken. Drops of water clung to the leaves, catching the light like small truths revealed after a storm. She used to love mornings, I said. When she was little, she'd run into our room, jump on the bed, laugh like the sun couldn't rise without her permission. Enzo listened without interrupting. And then she grew up, I said quietly, and started believing that love had to be earned. That strength meant never showing softness. I think she learned that from me. Enzo reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. Or maybe she learned it from watching you survive, he said. There's a difference. His words warmed me more than the coffee, because they didn't erase my guilt. They dignified it. They said I had done my best, even when my best wasn't perfect. We sat there for a while, eating in silence. The house seemed lighter now, as if last night's darkness had been rinsed away. Outside, sunlight glistened over the wet pavement. The neighborhood cats were already prowling again, curious and alive. At some point, Enzo rose and opened the windows. A fresh breeze entered, cool, clean, carrying the scent of wet earth. It moved through the curtains, touched the tablecloth, and for a second, I felt like the whole house had inhaled. He turned to me, leaning against the counter. So, what will you do now? I thought about it for a long time before answering. Nothing, I said. For once, I won't try to fix things. I'll let time do its part. Maybe that's what love means when you're older. Not control, not rescue, just patience. He smiled. And forgiveness. I looked out the window again. The sunlight hit the droplets on the roses outside, turning them into small prisms of light. Forgiveness, I said softly, is a door. But you can't force it open. You wait until you're ready to walk through. He nodded, as if that answer satisfied something deep in him. Then he poured another cup of coffee, added a spoon of sugar, and handed it to me. Here, he said, sweetness helps. We laughed quietly, but there was truth in it. Sometimes healing doesn't come through conversations or apologies. Sometimes it comes in moments like that. A shared laugh, a cup of coffee, the smell of morning after chaos. When I finished my coffee, I walked out to the balcony. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon soft and open, like a clean page. Seagulls glided above the waves, their cries sharp but somehow joyful. I stood there, feeling the wind against my face, my hair brushing across my cheeks, and I thought, I'm still here. After everything, after loss, after shame, after silence. Behind me, Enzo spoke, his voice low, tender, like a promise wrapped in simplicity. You know, he said, people spend their lives trying to avoid pain, but sometimes, pain is just the body's way of asking you to start again. I turned toward him. He was leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching me with that same expression of quiet reverence he always had, as if he saw not what I was, but what I had survived. In that moment, I realized something I had never dared to admit before. Love, at this age, wasn't about beginning again. It was about continuing. With dignity, with grace, with truth. I walked back to him, placed my hands on his chest, felt the slow, steady rhythm of his heart beneath my palms. I think, I whispered, this might be the first morning of my life. He smiled, eyes soft. Then let's not waste it. We stood there for a while, letting the light fill the space between us. No grand gestures, no declarations, just the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen peace over pride. And though I knew Amanda's silence would return, and that the road to healing would be long and uneven, I also knew this. The woman I was before last night would have begged for understanding. The woman I was now would wait for it, without apology. If you've ever woken after a storm and realized that peace doesn't mean forgetting, if you've ever felt the strange beauty of calm after chaos, then you know what that morning meant to me. It wasn't the end of pain. It was the beginning of peace. Time passes differently when you've stopped running from yourself. Days stretch softer, hours breathe slower. It's not peace exactly. It's something quieter than peace. Something that doesn't need to be named. It's been 3 weeks since that dinner. The house feels different now. The air doesn't hold its breath anymore. There's light again, even in the corners that used to feel cold. Every morning, Enzo makes coffee before I wake up. He doesn't ask how I slept. He can tell by the way I stir the cup. If the spoon hits the porcelain softly, it's a good day. If it clinks too loud, he just smiles and says, "We'll fix it with sugar." He never talks about that night. And maybe that's what love really is. Knowing which memories need silence more than sympathy. Amanda hasn't called, not yet. At first, her silence felt heavy, like punishment. But with each passing day, it feels less like rejection and more like distance. The kind of distance every relationship must survive to be reborn. Sometimes I wonder what she tells herself about that night. Does she remember the taste of the wine or the weight of her own words? Does she think of the look in Enzo's eyes? Not anger, not pity, just truth. I don't know. And for the first time, I'm learning to live without needing to know. The world outside my window hasn't changed, but I have. The same street, the same waves, the same trees moving in the same afternoon wind. And yet, everything feels lighter. Because nothing in this house is pretending anymore. Not the furniture, not the walls, not me. One afternoon, while Enzo was at the restaurant, I found myself sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The sun was low, gold spilling across the floor like spilled honey. That's when I saw it. An envelope under the gate. No name, no address. Just handwriting I knew by heart. Amanda's. I held it for a long time before opening it. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from recognition. The letter was short, just a few lines. "Mom, I shouldn't have said the things I said. Maybe I was angry because you found peace before I did. I don't understand everything, but I'm trying. Give me time. Love, Amanda." I read it twice, then once more, and then I cried. Not the sharp, painful tears of regret, but the warm kind that wash away residue instead of reopening wounds. When Enzo came home, I showed him the letter. He read it silently, folded it carefully, and placed it back on the table. Then he kissed my forehead and said, "She didn't say sorry, but she said everything." He was right. Forgiveness doesn't always come wrapped in apologies. Sometimes it comes in the effort to understand. The next morning, I wrote back. No long explanations. No emotional sermon. Just a few honest words. "Amanda, you don't need to understand everything to start healing. Just come for coffee. The door's open." Mom, I left the letter on her doorstep the way she had left hers on mine. Then I went back home and waited. Not anxiously, patiently. Because peace, once you've tasted it, teaches you how to wait. 2 days later, she came. No makeup, no armor, no audience. Just my daughter, standing at the door with hesitant eyes. She didn't speak at first. Neither did I. We just stood there, two women who had loved, lost, and hurt each other in the name of protection. Then, without a word, she walked in and hugged me. It wasn't a movie hug. It was real, imperfect, trembling, full of unspoken truth. I felt her heartbeat against mine, the same rhythm I once listened to through her tiny chest decades ago when she was a baby sleeping on my shoulder. That's when I knew we were both learning to forgive the same person, ourselves. The rest of the day passed in simple gestures, coffee, laughter, small silences that didn't hurt anymore. She told me she had watched one of Enzo's cooking videos online. "He's good," she said with a half smile. "Still too young for you, though." I laughed. And for the first time, her teasing didn't sting. Because beneath the joke, there was something else. Acceptance. When she left that afternoon, she kissed my cheek. Not out of obligation, out of love. And as I closed the door behind her, I realized that sometimes love does return, not in the way you expect, but in the way you can finally receive. Later that night, Enzo and I walked along the beach. The sky was violet, the tide low, the air thick with salt and memory. He slipped his hand into mine, and we walked without speaking. Words would have been too small anyway. I looked at the horizon and thought about how strange life is. How something that begins in pain can end in peace. How something as fragile as a dinner could change everything. I used to believe age meant endings, that passion and discovery belonged to the young. But now I know the truth. Age isn't the end of desire. It's the beginning of discernment. We no longer fall in love with potential. We fall in love with presence. If you've ever lost yourself and found your way back, if you've ever learned that peace isn't given, it's chosen, then you understand what that night, and everything after, really meant. It wasn't a story about a daughter and a mother, not even about a man too young or a woman too old. It was a story about dignity, the quiet kind, the one that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. So, if this story touched something in you, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and tell me, have you ever had to choose between keeping peace or proving your point? And don't forget to leave a like, because sometimes, what keeps us human isn't how loudly we defend ourselves, but how softly we learn to begin again.